The war never asked for permission before entering a man's life. It simply arrived, like smoke slipping under a door, quiet, invasive, and impossible to ignore. For Thomas Hale, a soft-spoken factory worker from a rusted town in Pennsylvania, the war had come not with a bang or a patriotic summons, but with an empty seat at the dinner table. His younger brother, Daniel, had been drafted the year before, and letters from him stopped coming weeks ago. No one in the Hale family spoke about it out loud, but silence grew in the house like frost. Thomas did not fight on the front. He did not hold a rifle or storm a beach. He worked far behind the lines, in a massive steel plant where the air was thick with heat and metal dust. To him, it felt like he had been exiled from the courage of others, condemned to contribute from afar. Yet history often reveals that war is not decided only on the front. Sometimes victories are forged in the shadows, by men who never saw the battlefield but shaped the tools that fought upon it. He was 27 years old, tall but slightly hunched as if apologizing for taking up space. His brown hair was always damp from sweat, sticking to his forehead beneath the soot-blackened cap. His eyes were gentle, almost too gentle for the place he came to every day, a roaring, blazing, relentless world of molten steel and heavy machinery. The factory was a place where men shouted to be heard and slammed iron against iron until sparks burst like fireworks. But Thomas rarely shouted. He let his work do the talking. The plant had a contract with the Army to produce armor plates and internal structures for Sherman tanks. Every weld, every seam, every joint mattered, even if supervisors only cared about quotas. The U.S. needed tanks, fast, and the pressure to speed production sometimes created shortcuts, compromises, and mistakes. Thomas hated mistakes. He was not the most skilled welder when he started, but he was the most stubborn. He believed metal responded to respect, not force. His mentor, an old welder named Gus Harper, used to say, "Steel will tell you what it wants if you listen." Thomas listened. After Gus retired, Thomas became the man in the factory who rarely spoke but whose welds everyone trusted. He worked the night shift because he liked the quiet. When the machines cooled slightly and the noise faded, he felt he could hear the metal better. Some of the foremen made fun of him, joking that he treated steel like a living thing. But Thomas didn't mind. In his hands, metal wasn't dead. It was potential, waiting to be shaped, strengthened, and guided. One night, during the bitter cold of early winter, the factory received a rush order. 10 new Sherman turrets were needed immediately. Intelligence reports claimed German panzer divisions were pushing harder than anticipated. The Americans needed reinforcements, and every hour mattered. The supervisors barked instructions, telling welders to work faster, skip unnecessary passes, and trust that the steel would hold. But steel did not care about urgency. It cared about precision. That night, as Thomas examined the first turret, he noticed a problem. The steel plates they received were from a different supplier than usual. The texture was slightly different, the grain within the metal a little less uniform. He could feel it through his gloves, the way a musician feels a false note. He tested a small section with a standard weld. When he cleaned the slag, he saw small cracks forming near the edges, almost invisible. Most welders wouldn't have noticed. Many didn't even check their passes before moving to the next seam. But the cracks worried him. They meant the steel had microfractures that could expand under stress, like when a shell exploded nearby or when a tank shell struck the turret directly. He took the piece to the supervisor, Mr. Aldridge, a man more concerned with clipboard signatures than structural integrity. "What is it now, Hale?" Aldridge muttered, annoyed before the conversation began. "This steel isn't reacting right," Thomas said quietly. "It needs slower cooling and double-layer welding." Aldridge scoffed. "We don't have time for artistic welding. Just finish the seams." "It won't hold," Thomas insisted. "Under heavy impact, a crack could." "Your job is to weld, not think," Aldridge snapped. "Finish the job or someone else will." Others might have obeyed, but Thomas felt responsible for every tank that left the factory. He imagined soldiers inside, relying on armor they assumed would protect them. He imagined his brother, if he was still alive, inside one of those tanks. That image tightened his chest like a vice. He returned to his welding booth and stood there for several minutes, staring at the turret in front of him. He knew the right way to weld it. He also knew it would take twice as long. And if Aldridge found out he was ignoring instructions, he could be fired. But when he picked up the torch, he made his decision. He welded the turret his way, his mentor's way, the correct way. He adjusted the heat, changed the cooling rhythm, and created a double-layer seam that looked unremarkable from the outside, but deep beneath the surface, it was far stronger. He worked in silence. Only the hiss of the torch and the soft clatter of cooling metal accompanied his thoughts. When he finished, he inspected the weld with a magnifying lamp. No microcracks, no imperfections. It was strong enough to withstand direct impact. The night supervisor noticed he was behind schedule but shrugged it off. Day shift would ask questions, but Thomas didn't care. He had done what needed to be done. For the next 9 days, he repeated the same process, quietly disregarding the rushed instructions, modifying the temperature, adjusting the weld pattern, and reinforcing every single turret that came across his station. He hid his work by smoothing out the exterior so it looked ordinary. Only an expert eye would detect the deeper weld layers hidden beneath. He didn't tell anyone, not because he wanted credit, but because he didn't trust that the truth would matter to men who valued speed over safety. By the 3rd week of December, all 10 tanks were shipped overseas. Thomas returned to his routine, welding silently in the shadows, holding on to the faint hope that somewhere in Europe, those turrets would protect the men inside them. He could not protect Daniel, but perhaps he could protect someone else's brother. Winter turned to spring. The war dragged on. Casualties mounted. The factory grew louder, busier, more frantic. Thomas kept working, his focus unbroken, his welds always precise. No one except him knew that 10 Shermans out in the war zone had armor unlike any others, armor forged not by haste, but by intention. He might never have known what happened next if it weren't for a letter. It arrived in early April, addressed to the factory, not to him personally. The envelope bore the Army emblem and the familiar stiffness of official communication. Supervisor Aldridge opened it in the break room while workers gathered around. He cleared his throat with the self-importance of a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. "This letter is from Captain Harris of the 34th Armored Division," he announced. "Says here they have a commendation for the weld work on Shermans numbered 782 through 791. Claim these tanks took multiple direct hits and stayed operational." The room fell silent. Aldridge continued reading. The captain writes, "We do not know which welder was responsible, but the craftsmanship of those turrets saved dozens of lives. The weld seams held where others failed." Thomas froze. His heart pounded in his ears. The letter went on to explain that during a fierce engagement, German anti-tank guns had targeted the American convoy. Several Shermans had been disabled or destroyed, but 10 of them, exactly 10, had remained functional despite sustaining repeated hits. Their armor held long enough for the crews to return fire, retreat, or rescue nearby infantry. Mechanics had examined the tanks afterward and found unusual reinforcement patterns inside the welds. Welds that were not standard Army procedure. Welds that only one man in that factory knew how to make. Aldridge frowned. "Which one of you worked on those?" No one spoke. Then a machinist named Reggie glanced toward Thomas, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You were on the turret line in December, weren't you, Hale?" Reggie said. Thomas swallowed, suddenly uncomfortable under the weight of attention. "I just did my job," he murmured. But word spread quickly. Workers murmured, some patting him on the shoulder. Aldridge said nothing. His silence admitted everything. He had pushed for speed, but Thomas had chosen quality, and saved lives because of it. A week later, another letter arrived. This one addressed directly to Thomas. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten note from Captain Harris himself. "Your welds saved my crew and many others. We owe you our lives." There was more. A list of the tank crews. Names, ages. Some had families. Some were barely old enough to shave. One line caught Thomas's breath. Tank 789 protected an infantry squad pinned under machine gun fire. Armor held after 3 hits. No casualties. He set the letter down, overwhelmed. In that moment, the noise of the factory seemed distant. He did not feel pride, not exactly. It was something quieter, something heavier. A realization that his silent labor had echoed across the ocean into the lives of men he would never meet. But the story did not end with the letter. The Army launched an investigation into welding inconsistencies. Engineers visited the factory, inspecting Thomas's techniques. Instead of reprimanding him for deviating from the schedule, they recognized the brilliance of his adjustments. His method became part of a revised welding protocol for the remaining Sherman production runs. Other factories adopted it too. He had not just saved the crews of those 10 tanks. He had indirectly strengthened hundreds more. Yet Thomas did not see himself as a hero. He continued working, kept his head down, and welded with the same quiet devotion. But other workers watched him differently now. They asked him for advice. They slowed down their own welds, just a little. They listened to the metal the way he did. A ripple effect began, quality spreading through a factory that had once been obsessed only with numbers. Months later, in August 1944, a military jeep arrived at the factory unexpectedly. Word spread through the plant like wildfire. Soldiers stepped out, followed by a tall officer with a warm, confident expression. He introduced himself as Major Everett Collins. "I'm looking for Thomas Hale," he said loudly. Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped forward, hands still trembling from the grinder he'd been using. "Sir," Major Collins smiled, "I came to shake your hand." And he did, firmly, sincerely. "My men lived because of you. That's not something we forget." Thomas felt heat rise in his chest, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper, a validation he had never sought but desperately needed. For the first time since Daniel's letters stopped, he felt a spark of hope that maybe, somewhere, the world still had room for good consequences. The major presented him with a commendation, a certificate acknowledging his contributions to armored safety. The factory workers applauded. Even Aldridge, reluctant and stiff, joined in. Thomas didn't speak much that day. He didn't know how to express the storm inside him. But he remembered every face in the crowd, every handshake, every quiet thank you. He remembered, too, the families who would never know that their sons had survived because of a man they'd never met, a man who welded in the dark and trusted his instincts. The war ended the following year. Factories shut down military production and returned to civilian goods. Some workers left, others adapted. Thomas stayed for a while, but the factory felt different without the urgency of war. Eventually, he left and opened a small welding shop, fixing farm tools, machinery parts, and the occasional collapsed porch railing. People who brought their equipment to him always said the same thing: "Your welds never break." They didn't know why. They didn't know his history. They didn't know that every seam he created carried the same quiet determination that had once held back enemy shells. Years passed. Life moved on. Thomas married a schoolteacher, raised 2 daughters, and grew old with the same humility he'd always carried. But every now and then, on anniversaries, on holidays, on days when memory felt heavy, letters would arrive from men he had never met. Veterans, children of veterans, sometimes grandchildren, all of them writing to say thank you. They wrote because they had heard stories. Stories told by tank crews who lived to see the end of the war. Stories of 10 Shermans that refused to die under fire. Stories of weld seams so strong they became legend within the armored divisions. Stories of a man named Thomas Hale who welded in silence but forged survival in every line of molten steel. In the end, his legacy was not written on monuments or carved in marble. It lived in the quiet gratitude of those who survived. It lived in every life touched by the men who made it home. It lived in the knowledge that a factory worker, a man without medals, without rank, had saved dozens of tanks and countless lives simply by refusing to do less than his best. And though Thomas never sought recognition, though he worked in the shadows and never raised his voice, history remembers people like him. Because sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are performed not on the battlefield, but in the places where no one is watching, where one man and a welding torch stand between life and death, where silence is not weakness but strength. Forged in silence, his work endured. And through it, so did they.